Hey everyone, we're starting with someone who played a big role in history tonight. The medieval peasant was the unsung hero of Europe, the backbone of the economy, and the human lab rat who tested every food, plague, and famine nature threw at them, mostly without surviving. Before you settle in, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is coming from all over the world to join us. If you really want to eat like a peasant from the Middle Ages, you need to wake up in the morning and wish you hadn't. The rooster wakes up at dawn and screams like it's being killed. A sound that is meant to remind you that happiness is a sin and sleep is a luxury you will never be able to afford. You get out of bed on a straw mattress that is as comfortable as a sack full of broken twigs and bugs that moved in overnight. It's time for breakfast now. You come up, the fireplace where the cottage lives. And I mean lives. This thing has been going on for longer than you've been alive. It's a family heirloom that isn't very nice. Every morning, water is added to the thick sludge at the bottom to make it thinner. Ingredients. The family didn't starve to death eating grains, beans, roots, and the occasional mystery chunk that could be a vegetable or not. The pot is never completely clean. People in the Middle Ages didn't wash their dishes. They simply kept boiling until the bacteria either died or became saints. The taste is complicated. What if depression had a flavor? Think of angry, warm mud. Picture yourself chewing on something and thinking, this has a history. If you're lucky, someone will throw in a carrot. Not for food, just to lift spirits. A bright orange dot of hope in a sea of beige sadness. Then there's bread, a medieval treat made of rye flour, water, and pure hatred. Thick, dark, and able to break more than just teeth, but the morale of the next generation. Because milling was so bad, pieces of stone often got baked into the bread. Congratulations, your breakfast is now like Russian roulette for your teeth. The drink comes next. Everyone drinks weak ale, from kids to adults to old people, not because they want to party at 5 a.m., but because drinking water in the Middle Ages was like playing a game of chance with cholera. Weak ale is safe, has a little fizz, and gives you the tiny buzz you need to deal with disappointment, which is the number one breakfast spice for peasants. No fruit, no eggs, no cheese, unless it's older than you can remember. You eat your pottage, soften your bread, brick and beer, and think about whether life before farming was really better. And that's it for breakfast. A great way to get a taste of your whole medieval day. Not enough seasoning, structurally weak, and emotionally harmful, but somehow still able to live through it. The bread will definitely break your spirit if the breakfast porridge didn't. Peasant bread from the Middle Ages wasn't just food, it was an experience in geology. Forget soft loaves, golden crusts, and that warm smell of a bakery that makes people today believe in goodness. Peasant bread smelled like dirt, mildew, and the deep sigh of someone who gave up halfway through making it. Let's talk about the things that go into it. Peasants in the Middle Ages didn't have wheat unless the Lord dropped some. Their bread was made with rye, which is a tough, bitter, and somewhat resentful cousin of wheat. When there wasn't enough rye, people added things that shouldn't be in bread: acorns, ground beans, bark from trees, wild grasses, and any plant that looked the least poisonous that day. And then there's millstone grit, the secret medieval spice that no one asked for. Stone wheels ground the grain, which let small pieces of rock fall into the flour. So every loaf of bread was like a medieval jawbreaker, trademark, made to slowly wear down your teeth until they looked like chalk nubs. Archaeologists keep finding skeletons from the Middle Ages with tooth enamel that looks like pebbles in a river. Well done. That was from the morning meal. This is why peasants in the Middle Ages didn't need dentists. The dental procedure was their bread. Now for the texture. Imagine a loaf so heavy that it could be used as a weapon in a bar fight. It wasn't cut, it was talked about. Some peasants made it softer by adding ale, as some people put it in pottage. A few brave idiots tried to bite into it dry and left their sötbeschnist in the crust. The wealthy had soft white bread. The poor ate maslin, which was a sad mix of rye and other grains. The miller cleaned the floor. You didn't pick out maslin bread. You were chosen by maslin bread. If you were really unlucky, the rye got infected with ergot, a glowing black fungus that makes you have seizures, see things that aren't there, and think that Satan is trying to tap dance inside your head. Sometimes whole villages would trip together, which was like a rave in the Middle Ages, but with more screaming. But the worst part was that bread was the main food. You didn't get a slice, you got a brick, or even more than one brick, every day. Yes, peasants in the Middle Ages didn't worry about starving. They were afraid of chewing. If there was one thing that made medieval peasants happy, and happy is a strong word here, it was beer for breakfast. Not in a fun way, like two frat boys banging cans together at 8 a.m. in a way. No, this was beer for survival, the kind you drink because every drop of water in your village is out to get you. Animal poop is all over the rivers. The wells are full of bacteria, and the rainwater barrels are great places for things that grow to breed, legs, and crawl out at night. So peasants boiled everything, and eventually boiling everything turned into brewing. So weak ale is the most reliable and least deadly drink for breakfast. Don't picture peasants in the Middle Ages getting drunk at dawn and yelling philosophical ideas across the fields. Weak ale had very little alcohol in it, just enough to make it safe, but not enough to make you charming. It tasted like someone whispered the idea of beer into a bucket of warm water. But it was wet. It didn't kill you. And it sometimes covered up the taste of your daily bread brick. Kids drank it as well. Yes, little kids in the Middle Ages drank tiny tankers of ale before they could even say their own names. This makes sense of both medieval writing and medieval decision-making. It also explains why people back then didn't know anything about hydration or basic health. The process of brewing was adaptable. Every house had its own microbrewery, which is a romantic way of saying a clay pot that wasn't very clean. Standards. Yeast. They didn't get it, but they definitely made it mad a lot. The quality of the grain was different. The quality of the water, we shouldn't talk about it. but the end result was always the same: a drinkable liquid that didn't make you sick right away. On feast days, the ale was stronger, the good stuff, the kind of beer that made you forget you were going to surf with a landlord who thought bathing was witchcraft. But that wasn't beer for breakfast. The responsible brother was breakfast beer. Plain, watery, and kind of. Tastes like bread. A drink that reminds you that life is a long race of disappointments. Some peasants drank small beer, which was even weaker than weak ale, and tasted like barley-flavored sadness. But it kept them alive, hydrated, and mildly buzzed enough to deal with the fact that they had to work on the farm for 14 hours without pay. So yes, medieval peasants woke up, stretched, and drank beer like it was water before coffee, orange juice, and their morning routines. It was by mid-morning, so the medieval peasant has been awake for 5 or 6 hours, plowing fields, feeding animals, hauling water, and wondering about every choice their ancestors made. Of course, this is the best time for a snack, which in peasant terms means something that you can hide in your pocket that isn't too tasty. This isn't really a meal. Whatever you were able to find before the rooster ruined your morning. There is no cheese plate, no trail mix, and no fruit bowl with a little bit of hope. Instead, your mid-morning. Usually, a snack is one of 3 things. An onion that isn't cooked. Yes, an onion. Just the onion. Like an apple, tears running down your face. Not because the onion is hot, but because this is how it is now. Peasants in the Middle Ages were always crying and acting like everything was fine. A little piece of cheese, but not the good kind of cheese. This cheese squeaks when you cut it, and it feels like an old boot that has been left behind. It is either very young and slimy or very olden, so it could break a wagon wheel if it fell. Nobody knows how old the cheese is. Nobody asks. In the Middle Ages, asking questions was risky. Bread that shouldn't be allowed, Maslin bread that was left over from yesterday. It's already hard enough to kill someone. You don't cut it up for a snack. You chip off pieces like a sculptor would chip stone off a block. It's easy to carry, lasts a long time, and can be used as building material in an emergency. Sometimes, to mix things up, peasants brought peas or broad beans that were still raw and still not good. Sometimes, a lucky person found some leftover salted fish and chewed on it all day like the world's saddest protein bar. And don't forget the food pouch, a leather bag that smells like regret, sweat, and 3 generations of mid-morning snacks. It was a must-have for the working class in the Middle Ages. This snack does not make people feel better. It doesn't give you more energy. It just puts off death. The goal is not to be happy. The goal is to stay alive long enough to eat more pottage later. Peasants didn't often sit down to eat this meal. They ate while they were walking, sweating, or digging. Life in the Middle Ages was like one long workout, but it didn't help your health. So yes, the snack in the middle of the morning isn't a break. It's a cry for help that looks like cheese. The medieval peasant has already done what we would call a full day's work by the time lunch comes. They have plowed, planted, hauled, chopped, shoveled, milked, sweated, and maybe even cried in a field where no one could see them. the reward for. All this work, which would be great if the reward weren't soup. Lunch in the Middle Ages is not something you look forward to. You eat it. You deal with it like you would with bad weather or a tax collector, with quiet acceptance and the understanding that fighting it is useless. The midday pottage is the same as the morning pottage, but it's a little hotter and a little more angry now. The tastes haven't gotten better. They've just had more time to realize their own life. You sit on the ground because people with money and fewer back problems can sit in chairs. There is a wooden bowl in front of you that is full of stew so thick that some peasants could and did stand a spoon up in it. The ingredients are still the same. There are still barley, beans, and whatever vegetables were forced to grow that season. The only thing that is different is the size of the portion. It's just enough to keep you working, but not enough to make you happy. If you happen to have meat, it's never a good cut. It's usually a thin strip of salt pork that has been cured so much that it could survive a nuclear winter. This meat isn't soft. It doesn't have any juice. It's hard. You chew it for so long that you start to wonder if it was ever alive. But the peasants thought it was a treat. This food had a taste, even if it was just salt and despair, which was better than everything else they ate. Sometimes bread shows up in the middle of the day. Even though it's this time of day, it has somehow gotten even harder. The crust feels like the outside of a castle from the Middle Ages. Soaking it in pottage helps, but not in the same way that soaking a brick in water makes it a little less of a brick. You don't feel better after lunch. It doesn't give you energy, but it keeps you from falling down in the field, which is the most important thing. After you eat, you stand up with knees that sound like church doors opening and go back to work, fueled only by willpower and a stomach that can handle pain. When you ate like a peasant in the Middle Ages, you had to deal with the weather, which wasn't always nice. Each one had its own special kind of food disappointment, with a changing menu of things that were hard to find, wilted produce, and the constant worry that this year's harvest might just give up and die out of spite. In theory, summer was the best time of year. There were crops growing, animals alive, and sunlight to remind you that the world wasn't all bad. But even peasants in the summer didn't eat like royalty. If the bugs in the garden hadn't thrown a party, they might have had peas, beans, leeks, and maybe even a cabbage. Yes, everything was fresh, but it was fresh in the way that it had just been pulled from the ground 40 minutes ago and still tasted like it. Summer meals were bright green and very boring, but at least there was food. Then came fall, a time of year that peasants both loved and hated. During harvest time, the work was so hard that your back wanted to file a complaint, but it also meant the best meals of the year: root vegetables, fruits, nuts, mushrooms, and anything else that nature hadn't hidden too well. The problem was where to put things. Peasants used salt, smoke, cellars, or blind hope to keep food fresh. And it turns out that being hopeful doesn't stop mold. Many fall treats were just summer foods that had given up on life. Winter was the real enemy of the medieval diet. When the frost came, your meals turned into a series of ways to stay alive. Everything was salted, including fish and pork. If it wasn't safe unless it was salted. Turnips that tasted like sadness and onions that could be used as weapons were some of the winter vegetables. The bread got harder, the pottage got thinner. Hope began to fade. There were feast days, but one day of roasted meat didn't make up for 90 days of bad food. Finally, spring, which is also called the season of hunger. The winter food stores were almost empty. The new crops weren't ready yet. Animals were still very thin, which was sad. During this time of year, peasants ate weeds instead of food. Trendy greens that were picked from the ground, but they were weeds. Dinner was whatever grew first, even if it tasted bad or looked like punishment. So yes, peasants ate food that was in season, but not in the way that influencers do today. They didn't choose their seasonal menu based on their own tastes. Famine, frostbite, and the ongoing war between humans and nature, which nature often won, shaped it. A medieval peasant's vegetable garden wasn't the happy, Instagram-worthy place that people today think it was. There were no heirloom tomatoes, raised beds, or cute clay pots with basil plants in them. The peasant garden was like a war zone, with people and nature fighting each other, and nature usually winning by a long shot. If we are being nice, we can call this garden a garden. It was a small fenced-in area of dirt, with vegetables that weren't chosen for their taste, but for their ability to survive pain. Vegetables from the Middle Ages weren't picky. They grew in bad soil and bad conditions, so they tasted bad. Taste wasn't a top priority. It was survival. The turnip was the most important plant in the garden, not because people liked turnips. People have never really liked turnips, but they were hard to kill. Drought. Turnips made it through. Frost. The turnips lived, hitting it with a stick, still probably alive. They were the bugs of medieval food. Then there were leeks, the medieval version of seasoning, even though they tasted like sad onions. Peasants acted like leeks, made their food better. But most of the time, leeks just happened. Long and limp, waiting to be boiled away. Cabbage also showed up a lot, usually as a big, watery head that smelled like it didn't want to be eaten. The garden was full of beans and peas. Not the modern kind that are sweet and crunchy, but the medieval kind that tasted like chalk and regret. They were very popular because they were filling. Peasants didn't eat for fun. They ate to keep from starving. Forget about herbs. Herbs were expensive things. Grown in the Lord's garden by the Lord's gardener using the Lord's time, soil, and stolen peasant labor. Commoners had two options if they wanted flavor: salt, which was expensive, or making their food taste good. They chose the second option more often. Then came the bugs, animals with stomachs, like rabbits, rats, insects, birds, and anything else. People who planted medieval gardens were the only ones who didn't eat there. Nature got half of the harvest. The other half went into pottage and went away without changing the taste at all. Taking care of the garden took hours of bending, hauling, weeding, watering, and yelling at plants that wouldn't grow. But the reward was a few vegetables that tasted like wet cardboard. That was how the garden looked in the Middle Ages. A successful act of work that made food that was just okay. If you lived in the Middle Ages and were a peasant, meat was not a food group. People talked about it around the fire in the winter, but it was just a rumor. Tasted once a month if God was in a good mood. Modern vegetarians would have said that most peasants ate too little meat. Let's begin with the fundamentals. The Lord owns the animals that live on your land. The deer that live in the woods, the Lord's. The rabbits are hopping around your yard like they own it. The Lord's. The boar breaks your fence. The Lord's too. He could legally own it if it breathed, walked on 4 legs, or could be roasted. It was called pulling it without permission. Poaching is a medieval word that means enjoy prison or try not to lose a hand. So peasants ate what they could find, which was usually pork fat, salted pork scraps, or the parts of animals that rich people didn't want. You don't get any pork chops. You get a piece of something that looks like it was mummified for the afterlife because it was so heavily salted. It wasn't soft. It wasn't juicy. It was a challenge for cooks. Chicken? Not common. People wanted chickens because they laid eggs. Killing one early was like set fire to your savings account. Beef? No way. Cows were too valuable to kill. You can only eat mutton if a sheep died of stupidity, illness, or spite. If you wanted fresh meat, you had to wait for slaughter season, which was a happy time in late autumn when animals were killed because they would die in the winter anyway. You might taste liver, kidneys, or heart on this wonderful day. Peasants in the Middle Ages didn't throw away anything. If it wasn't a hoof or a moral failing, it was food. Fish, on the other hand, was allowed, mostly because fish were too slippery to be legally owned by the Lord. Peasants ate eels, carp, and anything else they could catch in a river with a net and a prayer. But fish went bad quickly, so most of it was salted until it looked like a medieval chew toy. On holy days, everyone ate real meat, sang songs, and forgot that their stomachs were being held together by pottage and determination. But meat was rare in everyday life. It was a dream or a distant memory of something delicious that other people with more money, liked all the time. For the peasant, meat wasn't a meal. It was an event. Cheese was the only reliable source of protein, calcium, and mild emotional trauma for peasants in the Middle Ages. But don't picture cheddar wheels that are gold or brie wedges that are creamy. No. Peasant cheese was a completely different kind of cheese. The kind of dairy product that looked like it had been through a lot and wanted you to join it. Cheese started out in the Middle Ages, like most other things. Did, because they had to, and because they didn't have good storage. The milk went bad quickly. In the winter, cows made less milk, so everything had to be stored. Peasants made curdled milk on purpose, pressed it together, dried it, salted it, and prayed. The end product was kind of cheese. There were 2 main types, fresh cheese and aged cheese. Both had big problems. The dairy equivalent of a shrug, fresh cheese was soft, pale, and vaguely lumpy. It tasted mild, but suspicious, like something that wasn't dangerous yet, but could be. Given a strong wind or a stern look, peasants ate fresh cheese right away and nervously because it went bad faster than a marriage in the Middle Ages. Then there was cheese that had been around for a while. Cheese that is hard. Cheese that had been on the shelf for so long that it had become its own person. These wheels were heavy, sharp, and could stop an arrow from a short distance. They could leave a dent in a table if they fell. They could end a fight if they were thrown. Some historians think that ancient peasants didn't survive the winter because they ate a lot of food, but because their cheese was armor that you can eat. But texture wasn't the only thing that worried me. There were different levels of cleanliness. The milk pails weren't cleaned. They were cleaned. The curing vats were cleaned. Molds grew wherever they wanted. The cheese sometimes had a little too much personality, so peasants just cut around the part that looked like it had become aware. But cheese was still a staple. It was portable, filling, and easier to chew than bread, which was a miracle for peasants. You could take a piece of cheese with you into the fields, last through a workday, and probably even make it through a small apocalypse. Some lucky families also made whey soup, which was as bad as it sounds. Cheesem's leftover liquid was warmed up, salted, and drunk with the same enthusiasm as someone accepting their fate. People still respected cheese. It was worth something. It kept you alive, and most importantly, it almost never fought back. When the garden didn't work, the animals weren't yours, and the cottage tasted like pain that had been used before. Peasants turned to. The last choice, foraging, is a medieval practice that involves walking into the woods and hoping nothing will kill you. Foraging was necessary, risky, and completely unpredictable. Nature didn't care if you were hungry. Nature had its own plans, and your stomach wasn't one of them. But every year, peasants walked through forests, hedges, and riverbanks looking for food or anything that looked like it could be eaten if you squinted hard enough. Most of the things people found were berries, but not the sweet kind. People today love berries from the Middle Ages were smaller, sourer, and more suspicious. You'd pick up a bunch of them, and your fingers would turn purple like a crime scene. You'd hope they didn't have worms in them. Peasants thought that hound meat was extra protein, which says a lot about how people ate in the Middle Ages. Then there were nuts, the Nobel Prize of foraging, mostly hazelnuts and walnuts. These were valuable not only for eating, but also for trading, storing, and sometimes throwing at your cousin. But getting together, nuts were a competition. You weren't just trying to stay full, you were fighting with squirrels. And squirrels, whether they lived in the past or now, don't mess around. People also gathered herbs, but peasants didn't always know what they were. Some leaves made the pottage taste better. Others sent you on a spiritual journey to meet God before you were ready. People in the Middle Ages mostly guessed about herbs and what would happen if they were wrong. There were also mushrooms, which were like the lottery in the Middle Ages. Some filled your stomach, and some filled your grave. Finding out what mushrooms are was a skill that was passed down from one generation to the next. But memory from one generation to the next isn't always perfect. Someone would confidently say, "This one is safe," and 3 hours later, everyone in the village would be seeing colors that weren't there yet. Wild garlic and bok roots were also prizes. But it felt like I was taking part in a low-budget archaeological dig when I dug them up. You'd use whatever tool you had that hadn't broken yet to scrape the dirt and hope the root wasn't just another rock pretending to be one. Be food. Foraging wasn't just about getting food, it was about staying alive. In some years, it saved whole villages. Some years, when a fungus, berry, or mushroom wanted to get back at people, it killed half the population. But even though it was dangerous, the peasants kept foraging, crawling through brambles, avoiding animals, and eating whatever the forest gave them. Because when you're a peasant in the Middle Ages, hunger isn't a feeling, it's a way of life. Dinner in the world of medieval peasants was not a big ending. It wasn't a time to celebrate or feel better. It was just Pottage Round 2, the sequel that no one wanted and everyone was afraid of. But here it is again, bubbling in the same pot, ready to greet you like an old friend who won't take hints. The pottage has changed into something else by evening. It has been simmering all day, soaking up every piece of vegetable, grain, and emotional breakdown that happened in the kitchen. The texture is now thicker, like it was in the Middle Ages. Concrete mix, and the taste is stronger and weaker at the same time. It's a culinary paradox. It's thick, but watery, tasteless, but a too much, and good for you, but bad for your feelings. You sit at the table, which is really just a piece of wood that looks like furniture. Your bowl is made from one piece of wood, and it probably still tastes a little bit like tree. Everyone gets a ladleful of the pottage, but ladleful is a lot. It's more like someone takes a piece and out of the pot and hopes it slides. In the end, the things inside change from day to day. Sometimes it's heavy with barley. It's heavy on the turnips sometimes. Sometimes it's just a letdown. The vegetables have been boiled so much that they don't have any texture, color, or self-awareness anymore. Everything turns into a beige slurry, a single mass of food that makes no sense. If you have any bread left over, which is a big if, you can soak it in the pottage to make it soft enough for your teeth to survive. For a brief moment, it feels like a treat. Then the bread breaks down in the stew, and the story ends. It's a rare miracle to find meat in dinner pottage, perhaps a touch of pig fat. It could be a bone that has been boiled so many times that its ancestors are tired. But a bone in the pot is exciting. A bone in the stew means it had meat, which can make people feel better. Dinner is quiet. Not because it's quiet, but because talking wastes energy. The only sounds are the scraping of spoons and the far-off groaning of someone's back as they move on a stool. That came before reading. You don't feel full when the bowls are empty. You just feel a little less empty. Dinner doesn't fill you up. It just talks to it. But it's gas, and tomorrow we'll need more food, more pottage, more chewing, and more survival, like a medieval dinner. The feast day was a holy and very important event in the lives of medieval peasants. Not because it happened a lot, which it didn't, but because it was the only time of year when a peasant could feel something that looks a little like happiness. Feasts were like medieval holidays and buffets put together, but instead of casinos or beaches, you had a churchyard and a dirt floor. Because the church was in charge of everything, including when you could have fun, a feast was usually part of a religious holiday. And peasants took these chances very seriously. They would come early, wearing their cleanest tunic, the one with only 8 holes instead of 15, because a feast meant one thing: food, real food. On a feast day, the tables were full of things that peasants only dreamed about while eating stale bread. There was real meat, not just salted pieces or bone fragments. Pork cooked over an open flame, dripping with fat like a miracle from the Middle Ages. Herbs stuffed into chickens. Peasants didn't often leave the Lord's kitchen. Maybe even some beef cut into thick slices and shared like it was a holy thing. There were also pies, pastries with a savory filling, with meat, veggies, and hope. They were warm, rich, and seasoned, and they smelled like comfort, which peasants hardly ever smelled. There were desserts like honey cakes, fruit tarts, and puddings made with ingredients that were so rich they were almost sinful. It was even stronger than the ale. Not weak breakfast ale, but celebration ale, the kind that made grown men dance in public, which peasants did badly, but happily. Feasts were more than just food. They were big social events. Singing, dancing, laughing, fighting, hugging, and accidentally hitting someone during a folk dance. All the good, crazy things that happened in the Middle Ages. For one day, peasants didn't have to worry about work or hunger. They were part of something warm, lively, and social. Kids ran around with sticky fingers and a lot of energy from the sugar. Old villagers told stories that were probably not true and were very embarrassing. Even the animals seemed to be confused about why everyone was smiling. But like all good things in peasant, the music stopped, the fires went out, the leftover food disappeared faster than hope in February, and the next day, everyone went back to pottage. But for one wonderful night, the peasants got to live the life they never got to live. In the Middle Ages, preserving food wasn't a cooking skill. Every year, it was a desperate fight with death. Every fall, peasants would look at their harvest, look up at the sky, and say to themselves, "Let's see how much of this lasts until January without turning into a biological experiment." That's when the Holy Trinity came into play: salt, smoke, and the kind of prayer that is usually said at the end of life. Salt was the most important thing for staying alive. If you had enough, you could keep meat, fish, vegetables, and maybe even your sanity. Salt was too expensive, so peasants used it like people today use printer ink, sparingly, unwillingly, and while swearing. When they salted meat, they didn't just flavor it, they buried it. The meat didn't look as good. It looked more like a body ready for a royal funeral than dinner. Months later, when you dug it out, you hoped the salt had worked and not just kept the smell of failure. The second best choice was to smoke. Put the meat on the hearth. Let it sit in smoke for days until it becomes something like jerky or medieval plywood. It lasted a long time, mostly because even bacteria didn't want to get involved. The taste was like licking a chimney while chewing on a belt, but it didn't kill you, which was the norm. For food from the Middle Ages. Another way was to dry food. We cut up apples, beans, peas, and anything else that didn't run away, spread them out, and let them dry in the sun. Yes, bugs did get in sometimes, but peasants didn't freak out about them. Bugs were just extra texture or meat. If it moved, you flicked it. You acted like it never moved if it didn't. Of course, even if you tried your hardest, some food just changed. Barrels swelled in a scary way, jars hissed, and old bread grew fur that was thick enough to keep it safe. Winter, all by itself. That's when the peasants turned to the last way to stay alive: prayer and denial. You prayed if the food smelled bad. You prayed harder if it looked strange. You gave it to the pigs if it growled, thinking it was a sign from God. In the end, preserving food in the Middle Ages was never about taste. It was about staying alive with dignity hanging by a thread. Congratulations if your winter meals tasted like salted smoke and existential dread. You did a good job of keeping them. Bye. You're hungry again in the evening. Not hungry, not I could nibble something, but the kind of empty medieval hunger where your stomach starts telling its own sad story. The work for the day is done. Your arms and legs feel like they belong to a scarecrow, and now it's time for the most emotionally sensitive meal of the day, the evening snack. A food event held together by hope, crumbs, and low expectations. If you're lucky, and by lucky I mean blessed by at least 3 minor saints, you get a piece of bread from yesterday. Not warm or soft bread, but the kind of bread that is so old that it could break into your house at night and steal from you. This bread doesn't bend, it threatens. You don't chew it, you negotiate with it, slowly wearing it down like a river does to stone. Your jaw is going to complain to your skeleton by the end. You might get a roasted onion instead of bread at times. Yes, an onion. Eating a whole onion with pride, in public, and without shame. Peasants in the Middle Ages didn't think it was strange. They thought it was a dinner show. You would bite into that caramelized bulb and act like it was sweet. It really tasted like poverty, but with a slightly warmer aftertaste. If the day was really nice, you might get a cup of ale, not because you're celebrating anything, but because life in the Middle Ages was hard, and you needed something to help you deal with it. The beer isn't very strong, but it does take the edge off your hunger enough that your body stops threatening to eat itself. Kids drink it too because water is like medieval roulette, and no one wants to raise their kids on diseases they can't say. You don't always get warm pottage, fresh pottage, or cold pottage. Pottage that is cold, gelatinous, and morally questionable, and that shakes in a way that food shouldn't. You look at it, it looks back at you, you still eat it, it looks. And sometimes you don't get anything, just bad vibes and disappointment. You lie down and hope that tomorrow will magically give you more calories. A rabbit might come by. A neighbor might give you an egg in exchange. Your cabbage might grow 2 millimeters overnight in your garden. Hope in the Middle Ages was very clear, but no matter what you eat, the goal is the same. Eat something so you can sleep with at least a little bit of energy for the same pain tomorrow. When night falls over the village, everything hurts. Your feet hurt. Your back hurts. Your pride is hurt. Your hunger has even developed its own personality and is now pacing angrily. Inside your chest. But before giving in to sleep, every peasant in the Middle Ages had to do one last thing. The ale of survival late at night. This beer isn't fancy. It's not refreshing. It's not cold. It's not even that good. But it is there. That alone makes it a blessing in medieval Europe. You hold the cup like it's a cure, a way to save yourself, and a way to feel better all at once. You drink a little. It has a very light taste of barley, smoke, and whatever the cup was. Washed with, if it was washed at all. But right away, a warm numbness spreads through your body. Your stomach, which has been making noise all day, finally stops. Your muscles relax. You remember what peace feels like for a short time. This is when the regret starts to set in. Not the kind of regret that makes you question your life, just the normal kind from the Middle Ages. Regret that tomorrow will be the same thing again. You think about tomorrow's soup, bread, onion, and so on. Work that never ends. After that, you drink some more ale until you don't think about anything at all. When the ale has done its job and made the sharp edges of reality less sharp, it's time for bed, or the medieval version of a bed. You fall onto a straw mattress that makes a crunching sound like leaves in the fall and smells like animals, smoke, and decisions you didn't make. The straw pokes you in places you didn't know had nerve endings, but you're too tired to care. You move around until you find the most pokey part of the mattress stabs you in a way that you can handle. The blanket you have is made of rough wool and feels like it was made by someone who hated skin. Itchy, heavy, and probably home to a lot of bugs. But it's still warm, and warmth is a luxury. You curl up under it and listen to the quiet sounds of the village, distant snoring, clucking chickens, and a dog barking at a ghost that only it can see. Your stomach is growling. You don't pay attention to it. You'll eat again tomorrow. Not much, not well, but that's enough. You close your eyes. The ale pulls you down. The regret goes away. And with one last sigh, you say the medieval bedtime prayer. Please make tomorrow's stew taste less sad, and then go to sleep. Marco Polo never said, I entered the Great Khan's harem, because if he had, he would have disappeared into a remote Mongol steppe ditch right away. But in his notes, those weird half-coded parts that he said were just observations. There are cracks that are wide enough to let you see a hidden world. A world he shouldn't have been in. A world only for women in silk veils, eunuchs with perfect memories, and the emperor's most closely guarded secrets. And yet, Marco talks about things that no normal court visitor would have known unless he got a lot closer than he was supposed to. He talks about rooms set up like flowers, which sounds poetic until you compare it to UN architecture, which has circular suites radiating from a central pavilion, with each suite assigned to a different rank of concubine. He writes about women who change their clothes with the seasons and mentions fabrics that only people who live in the palace can wear. For spring, light Wager silks. For winter, heavy quilted brocades. And for the emperor's favorite companions, scented cotton robes. How would a merchant from another country know this unless someone showed it to him? But the weirdest hint is in how he talks about smell. Marco writes about scents that are layered like music, which is a very personal touch. The Mongol harem used a strong perfume, level of importance, High ranking friends wore musk and amberry. Lesser concubines could only drink iris water or rose. Servants weren't allowed to wear perfume at all. People didn't talk about these rules in court. The only people who knew about them were the ones who lived behind the silk curtains. Marco shouldn't have known about any of this, but he writes about it as if it were nothing more than the price of paper in the store. His tone also gives him away. He is usually a merchant listing interesting things in his travel diary, but his writing changes here. It becomes almost careful, tender, and observant in a way that suggests closeness. He talks about eyes that watch even when they're closed, voices that can calm storms, and rooms where the emperor is never alone, but no one dares to speak. Someone isn't just repeating rumors when they say this. Someone who was close enough to feel the room breathe said them. So, the first mystery of Marco Polo's secret notes is easy to figure out. If he really never went into the Herm, why does he?